In today's streaming age, 9 times out of 10, an album's artwork is the first exposure you'll have to that album before even listening to a single note. I bet in some cases, you even let said artwork influence your decision on whether or not to listen to an album. I know I fall in that group. I feel album covers often get overlooked for just how important they are in the ways we consume music. Don't feel so bad if you have taken album covers for granted. Visual artwork for music was an afterthought for decades while the music industry was shifting to evolve alongside the development of recording technology. Initially, 78 RPM records were packaged in cardboard sleeves, the same type of packaging you carry your wine bottles in. Eventually, 78 RPM records were sold in bulk, either grouped according to genres or a compilation of a single artist. These looked a lot like a photo book you'd see at your grandma's house. As before, the packaging was more or less of an afterthought. This all changed in 1938 when the newly founded Columbia Records hired Alex Steinweiss as their art director. One of his first assignments was to design promotional material for a compilation record of famed musical songwriter duo Rodgers and Hart. As legend would have it, Steinweiss was walking by the Imperial Theater near Times Square when he looked up at the marquee and had an idea that would change music forever. He asked the owner if he could temporarily swap out the letters to spell out the title of the compilation, took a picture, and thus the first album artwork was born. Since then, album artwork has grown into an entirely different animal. Some bands opt to not put a lot of thought into the art. Some artists put more thought into the artwork than the music itself. In this series, I want to dissect album covers and find out what works and what doesn't work. In this episode, I'm going to take a look at albums whose artwork looks like how the album sounds. This is a difficult comparison to weave. Unless you have synesthesia, it's arduous to describe how audio correlates to visuals. It's one of those gut feelings that defies explanation. We can describe it in bits and pieces, such as when a cut in a video syncs with the BPM of a song, or by even using emotions as the mediator between the auditory-visual relationship, such as how both the color red and aggressive music elicit feelings of anger. Even then, where do we draw the line? Some artwork literally depicts an artist playing live. In a literal sense, that is a perfect one-to-one, but that's too easy. I want to go deeper. So I have compiled 9 album covers that I believe perfectly depict the sounds and emotions of the music contained within them. Starting with the most famous example, this cover literally represents the foundation of shoegaze. You take a guitar, in this instance the actual guitar played by Kevin Shields, and then you put a bunch of effects over it until it only somewhat resembles the original. You can barely make out the subject through the various overlays and splots of hot pink brushstrokes. Speaking of the color palette, it's perfect. It's comforting while also being a bit claustrophobic. It's smothering you with a pink pillow until you are barely lucid enough to accept the warmth of the cotton. I've seen the countless alternate covers that try to recreate the original with different color palettes, and it just doesn't work the same for me. The use of hot pink and red tones, combined with the low opacity overlays, make the cover look both damp and bright. The same way the music of the album is bright and colorful despite being drowned in a wash of reverb. Shoegaze is an easy genre to represent visually. Just take a picture and throw over some off-center layers of lighter opacities and bam, that's what shoegaze sounds like. So for the rest of my picks, I'm going to refrain as much as I can from defaulting to a bunch of shoegaze covers. How does one depict isolation through sound? There's been many interpretations throughout history, but in 1979, Joy Division, with the help of producer Martin Hannett, threw their hat in the endless ring. Hannett used production techniques to achieve the sonic equivalent of being kept in solitary confinement. The band sounds as if they are playing through a speaker you can't quite pinpoint the location of. Isolation through sound? Check. Now, how do you depict isolation through visual art? For that answer, we have to go a bit deeper. Artist Peter Saville drew inspiration from a pulsar data visualization graph. What's a pulsar, you may ask? A pulsar is a highly magnetic compact star that emits intense beams of electromagnetic radiation from its poles. These beams are highly concentrated and can only be seen when pointed directly at the observer upon rotation, similar to a lighthouse. The icon seen on Unknown Pleasures is a stack of measurements generated by the radio signals from a pulsar, the peaks in the middle being when the star beams were pointed directly at the measuring instrument. If the album cover were to be treated as a POV, we as the viewer are to believe we are stuck in a dark room with this figure. You in this collection of waves that is just far enough away to seem distant and ever out of reach. Finding out that this object is comprised of data taken from a star millions of miles away only adds to feelings of isolation and vast emptiness. There is no comfort to be gained in the presence of this object, just as there is no comfort to be gained from hearing Ian Curtis's shouts from what sounds like a few meters away. People may hate on how iconic this album cover became, but in my mind, all praise is well deserved. It's hard for an album's cover to be this in lockstep with its accompanying music, and such accomplishments deserve praise, no matter how excessive it may become. Not only does this cover perfectly fit the glitchy, lush instrumentals of this album, but this is in serious contention for one of my favorite covers of all time, Hard Stop. I couldn't find much information on Ellie and Fortunato, who are credited with designing this cover. However, there is a whole lot of information on the structure right here. This formation, seemingly to only exist on paper through the mind of someone probably on acid, is a sample taken from a real-life housing complex that you can actually purchase a unit in and reside at for only $2,950 a month for a 2-bedroom. Habitat 67 is an experimental housing project designed by architectural legend Moshe Safdie as his thesis project while attending McGill University. Eventually, he was given funding to develop the idea for Montreal's 1967 World Fair. The design was inspired by the idea of creating housing that met the rapidly increasing velocities of industrial society, which needed efficient designs that also met individuals' needs for suburban comfort. Backstory aside, this album makes me feel like I'm traversing in this ever-mutating housing complex through a prism contained within the bounds of a 2D grid surrounded by rainbows. The art is reminiscent of the design for whimsical PS2 games such as Katamari Damacy and Metropolis Mania. It has a childlike charm to it while not reveling in the past. The same way the music evokes nostalgia through its simple pop melodies while being accompanied by instrumentals that were pushing way past the years in which they were being produced. The 4 elements that make up this cover all do their own separate job of representing a component of the album. In recent years, Velocity Design Comfort has received a new wind of praise, to the point where I could see the cover becoming a meme the same way Unknown Pleasures has. And in my opinion, all of it earned. Not too much to say about the story behind this album's cover, other than it was designed by Injury Reserve's very own producer/beatmaker, Parker Corey. It depicts what looks like walking through a toxic wasteland, staring in the eyes of a being possessing the only bit of non-orange light for miles. Whether this figure is benevolent or malevolent is up to the viewer, the inability to tell being the most frightening aspect. The music from the album sounds as if it came from this wasteland. Nothing is distinguishable from the haze, the same way many of the sounds from the album are nearly indistinguishable from the notes and rhythms they are made from. There is a myriad of white scratch marks floating behind our focal point, almost resembling angel wings. There lies a small fractured bit of hope behind the despair. But for now, it's not the first or even 7th thing you notice immediately. If you haven't, please give this album a listen, as I imagine it's going to top a lot of year-end lists. Does anyone remember that photo that contained a bunch of objects, yet somehow you couldn't name a single one of them? This is the album equivalent of that. The cover was designed by self-taught graphic artist Dave Rudnick, who among his other specialties, hones in on typographic design. This isn't a comprehensive description, but an aspect of it involves taking specific fonts and letters to create designs that barely resemble the objects they came from. I had a friend who would do this in high school, where he'd open up a Word document, take a random letter with a font, and use tools such as beveling and glow effects to transform them into really intense designs. Now I'm assuming Mr. Rudnick's process is a bit different, but it is cool seeing those concepts applied to real-world graphic art. What's great about Cavalcade's design is that you can probably infer what the source of each individual object is if isolated, but put together it takes on its own composition whose parts are indistinguishable from one another. The same way this album is filled with a cacophony of different instruments, who on their own are recognizable, but thrown together creates a compounded sound, whose moving parts have been blended with the rest, the same way the ingredients of a cake blend together once you mix them. What's even crazier is the idea of the tools Rudnick used to achieve this design, such as the aforementioned beveling, the same way stained glass artists from centuries past achieved the illusion of 3 dimensions through beveling tricks of their day. The music of Cavalcade also takes specific concepts that have existed for hundreds of years, such as ascending fourths, signaling finality, and modernizes them the same way Rudnick does with his digital art, a carefully woven chaotic cover for a carefully woven chaotic album. I know I probably give this album too much credit, but it is truly one of a kind. I also promised I would stray away from talking about more shoegaze, but this album gets an exception. The music on Loveless is walking into this abandoned looking house in the middle of nowhere with a black and white grainy filter applied. It's a mix of the first 30 minutes of Wizard of Oz and Courage the Cowardly Dog, the isolation of being surrounded by these cold, ever-suppressing textures. If by the time I get to Phoenix's cover resembles Fallout New Vegas, then Loveless is the opening to a Silent Hill game, while the music from the album is ever faintly playing in the background. Check out my recommendation of this album to find out more, or just listen to it. I guess you can do that too. The design concept for this album is simple. Created by Touche Amori's Nick Steinhardt, it's the color inside your eyelids when looking up at the sun with your eyes closed. Typically, sunshine is associated with happiness, soaking it up, fun in the sun, the whole song and dance. The idea behind the album and its cover is to take that concept and twist it to where the path to achieving that happiness is its own misery. The cover frames the sun's beams as being inescapably oppressive, the custom font making it seem as if the letters are being buried in the immense rays. The music of Sunbather creates a wall of sound the same way the gradient on the cover creates a wall of light. It's impressive how they're able to so succinctly capture all of these ideas into one simple package, both through its music and artwork. Another underappreciated record. The sound of this album is drowning in fuzz. It sounds like that static feeling you get when your arm falls asleep, or when you touch the screen of an analog television. So then, how do you visualize that feeling? I can't quite explain it, but the cover for Blame Confusion is what the sound of a guitar fuzz looks like. The album itself is comfortably repetitive without feeling oppressive. Just like the cover, with the softly repeating brown and gray tones, creates a calming pattern. But seriously, if you're a fan of fuzz heroes like Metz and Pyle, I highly recommend this album. This album was coming at a time when Kanye was in full control of his powers. After firmly planting his flag into the music industry, Graduation was released as a victory lap. It was where Kanye blasted into a new echelon of stardom. It's a great album. Personal favorite if you ask me. The cover was designed by revered Japanese artist Takashi Murakami, who pioneered the superflat movement, which is a critique of the Western consumerism forced upon Japan post-World War II that is achieved by incorporating traditional Japanese art with commercial iconography. Before we get too ahead of ourselves, let's take a look at the album art itself. The launching pad, or whatever the yay bear is being blasted from, is the only speaker that is worthy of playing Graduation's music, as if the sounds are being generated from that contraption. The colors elicit the early evening of a summer night, one that will eventually ascend into something greater than the sum of its parts. Its hyper-style reminiscent of the excess you'd find in games such as Jet Set Radio or animes such as FLCL. And then, there's the obvious place it has in Kanye's career. The excessive stylization is the only way to portray Kanye's Graduation into his new role of generational pop star. In this piece, Murakami was able to so perfectly weave the internal and external factors that influence the music of this album into the ultimate graduation party. Hopping back to the background, what I find fascinating is the intersection of Murakami's ethos and Kanye's career path. There's quite the intentional irony in bringing in an artist who uses commercial art to mock the ideas of consumerism to design the cover for an album that basks in the glory of it. Murakami would end up using the design concepts from Graduation in his future exhibits, further blurring the lines between commercial and traditional art. So those were 9 examples that I curated, but trust me, there are hundreds of examples that I could have used. Let me know if there are any I should have discussed, and who knows, I can make a sequel to this video. As always, like, subscribe, and click on the recommended video to watch another one just like this. This is Cole from Denoted, signing out.